On the morning of April 13, 1945, the landscape of central Germany lay in ruins. The fields near the small town of Farsleben were scarred by retreating German troops, bomb craters, and abandoned vehicles. The war was nearing its end, yet chaos still ruled the countryside. A reconnaissance patrol from the U.S. 30th Infantry Division moved cautiously along a rural rail line west of Magdeburg. Their orders were routine: secure the area, check for mines, and report any remaining German movements. But that day, they found something that was not part of any military plan. Ahead of them, on a slight bend in the tracks, stood a long, motionless freight train. Its black wagon stretched for nearly half a kilometer. Their doors bolted from the outside, the metal streaked with rust and soot. No guard were in sight. At first glance, it looked like another abandoned transport, one of the countless trains left behind as the German front collapsed. But then the soldiers heard faint sounds carried by the wind, a cough, a cry, something that did not belong to a machine. When they approached, they noticed movement behind the slats of the wooden doors. The noises grew clearer, whispers, sobs, and a desperate tapping from inside. The air was still cold, and the smell of decay hung around the wagons. One of the men climbed up, forced a latch open, and pulled back the heavy door. The sight that met them froze everyone in place. Inside, hundreds of human beings lay crammed together in the darkness. The floor was covered with straw, excrement, and scraps of cloth. The air was thick, foul, and suffocating. Emaciated faces stared back at them, their eyes wide and hollow. Some were too weak to lift their heads. Others reached out trembling hands toward the light, afraid that it might vanish again. Women clutched children who no longer moved. Elderly men sat against the walls, their bodies little more than bone. The soldiers had seen combat for months. Towns reduced to rubble, civilians fleeing, prisoners of war lined up by the hundreds. But nothing prepared them for this. These were not soldiers or workers. They were survivors of something far worse. They had been locked inside these wagons for more than a week, without food, without water, left to die on the tracks. They were Jews from the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, evacuated as the Allies advanced. The train, one of 3 that had left the camp, had broken down between the German and American lines. The guards had fled, leaving their captive behind. A silence settled over the men as the truth took shape. The war that had seemed close to ending suddenly revealed another dimension, one that no victory could erase. Some of the prisoners were dead, their bodies lying beside the living. Children cried weakly, too malnourished to stand. A few survivors tried to explain where they'd come from, but their voices cracked, and the words dissolved into sobs. In that moment, the mission of the patrol changed. The soldiers no longer saw a rail line or a tactical position. They saw a vision of humanity on the edge of extinction. They began pulling people out, one by one, carrying them into the daylight. The spring wind was cold, but it felt like life. Among the hundreds of faces, one image stayed in memory. A small girl, her cheeks hollow, her hair matted with dirt, staring up at the uniformed men. When she saw the white star on their sleeves, she tried to smile. It was faint and fleeting, but it was the first expression of hope the soldiers had seen that day. That smile, fragile yet defiant, would later be described by one of the rescuers as the moment he truly understood what they had been fighting for. The war in Europe was not yet over, but for those few hours on the tracks near Farsleben, the meaning of victory had changed forever. The people inside those wagons had been trapped for more than a week, caught between life and death in the collapsing remains of the Third Reich. They were among the thousands evacuated from the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in early April 1945, when German authorities began dismantling the camp ahead of the advancing Allied forces. The Nazis intended to move selected groups of Jewish prisoners eastward, deeper into territory still under German control, possibly toward their Seisenstadt or other camps that had not yet fallen. But the plan was chaotic from the start. Trains departed hastily, packed beyond capacity, with little food and no clear destination. In the final days of the war, even the machinery of death was breaking down. The train that ended up near Farsleben carried around 2,500 people. Many were Hungarian, Dutch, Polish, or Czech Jews who had already survived years of forced labor, starvation, and disease inside Bergen-Belsen. Among them were hundreds of children. When the train left the camp on April 10, 1945, the guards sealed the cars shut. Each freight car held between 60 and 100 people. There was no ventilation except for cracks in the wood. The prisoners were given almost no water and only a handful of bread or potatoes for the journey. The guards themselves had no clear orders, only vague instructions to move east and avoid capture. As Allied forces advanced from both directions, the train became lost in the shifting front lines. The journey soon turned into a nightmare. Days passed without food or relief. The smell inside the wagons became unbearable, a mixture of excrement, sweat, and decay. The temperature dropped at night, and the weakest began to die quietly, their bodies left lying beside the living. Mothers tried to keep their children awake, whispering to them, urging them to hold on. Some prisoners tried to collect rainwater through cracks in the wood with scraps of cloth. The sound of coughing and crying filled the train until even that faded into silence. When the locomotive finally stopped near Farsleben, it was not because the guards had reached their destination. The front had overtaken them. American and Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance. German troops were retreating in disarray, and the guards panicked. They left the train on the tracks, uncertain whether to flee or surrender. A few remained nearby for a time, but most soon disappeared. The prisoners were left alone, locked in the cars, with no one to open the doors. Inside, the situation became desperate. People began to lose consciousness. Some prayed. Others simply stared at the walls, unable to move. For many, this was not their first encounter with death, but now it came without guards or gas chambers, only silence and neglect. They had survived years of imprisonment, only to die in a forgotten corner of Germany, a few days before liberation. Outside, the countryside was eerily calm. Villagers knew the train was there, but few dared to approach. By April 13th, many inside had stopped calling for help. The last of their strength had run out. Had the American patrol not stumbled upon the tracks that morning, the train would have become a rolling tomb. The tragedy of the Farsleben train symbolized the breakdown of an empire built on cruelty. Even as Germany crumbled, the machinery of deportation continued to function blindly, consuming lives until the very last hour. The men, women, and children trapped inside, those cars represented what the war had reduced Europe to, millions of nameless victims caught between collapsing regimes and advancing armies. Their suffering was not recorded in battle reports or maps, but it was every bit as real as the battles being fought nearby. When the Americans opened the wagons, they did not just find survivors. They found the evidence of how close civilization had come to erasing itself. Each face inside told the same story. A people carried across Europe not toward freedom, but toward oblivion. If the patrol had arrived even a day later, there might have been no one left to tell what had happened. The train at Farsleben stood as a grim reminder that even in the final hours of victory, the price of indifference was still counted in human lives. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing under the combined pressure of the Allied advance from the west and the Soviet assault from the east. German cities lay in ruins, and the infrastructure that had supported the Nazi war machine was disintegrating. Roads were clogged with refugees, retreating soldiers, and endless columns of prisoners of war. The Allied forces were closing in on the Elbe River, the line that would soon mark the boundary between the American and Soviet zones. Every day brought the liberation of new towns and, more hauntingly, new camps, each one revealing evidence of systematic starvation, disease, and mass murder. Bergen-Belsen, located in Lower Saxony near the town of Celle, was one of the most infamous of these camps. It had originally been built as a prisoner of war facility, but by 1943 it was repurposed as a concentration camp, first for Jews considered exchangeable for German citizens abroad, and later as a dumping ground for prisoners evacuated from camps farther east. By early 1945, Bergen-Belsen was overwhelmed. More than 60,000 people were crammed into an area designed for a fraction of that number. Food supplies had collapsed. Sanitation was non-existent, and epidemics spread uncontrollably. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis killed thousands every week. The ground was covered with corpses that the prisoners were too weak to bury. As the British Army advanced from the west, the German command faced a dilemma. They knew the Allies were only days away from reaching the camp, in an effort to prevent the discovery of so many living witnesses, or perhaps to use those witnesses as bargaining chips. The SS ordered the evacuation of several thousand prisoners. Between April 6 and April 10, 1945, 3 trains were assembled to carry selected inmates eastward. Some historians believe the SS hoped to deliver them to their Seienstadt in Czechoslovakia, which was still under German control at that time. Others argue the intent was less defined, to move prisoners out of the path of the Allies and delay their liberation as long as possible. The process was chaotic. Prisoners were pulled from their barracks with little notice and forced onto overcrowded freight cars. Each car was sealed shut once filled, holding between 60 and 100 people. The guards, many of them young and inexperienced, received minimal instructions and had no clear destination. As the trains departed Bergen-Belsen, the front was already disintegrating. Bridges were destroyed, rail lines were bombed, and German troops were retreating in every direction. The trains were essentially set adrift in a collapsing empire. One of these transports contained roughly 2,500 men, women, and children, Hungarian, Polish, Dutch, and Czech Jews, many of whom had been in the camp for years. Among them were survivors from earlier deportations from Westerbork in the Netherlands, from Hungarian ghettos, and from camps in Poland. At least 500 were children. Conditions on board deteriorated quickly. The prisoners received almost no food or water. The locomotive often stopped for hours or days while German soldiers fled or tried to reroute the tracks. The journey, meant to last perhaps a day, stretched endlessly into uncertainty. Meanwhile, Allied forces were converging on the region. To the west, the U.S. Ninth Army and the British Second Army advanced toward the Elbe. To the east, Soviet troops were pushing westward through Brandenburg and Saxony. By mid-April, the area around Magdeburg became a shifting no-man's land. The train from Bergen-Belsen was caught in this moving front. Near the village of Farsleben, the railway line was damaged and the locomotive ran out of fuel. Surrounded by confusion and the sounds of distant gunfire, the German guards abandoned their posts and fled. The train was left stranded, filled with starving and sick prisoners, alone on the tracks between collapsing armies. For days it sat in silence, its doors still locked, until a reconnaissance patrol from the U.S. 30th Infantry Division happened upon on April 13, 1945. What they discovered was not simply another remnant war, but a direct confrontation with the human cost of the Nazi system in its final hours. The train near Farsleben became a symbol of the chaos of the Reich's last days, a desperate attempt to preserve control, undone by its own inhumanity. On April 13, 1945, a reconnaissance patrol from the U.S. 30th Infantry Division, consisting of elements of the 743rd Tank Battalion and the 119th Infantry Regiment, was moving through the countryside near Farsleben, west of Magdeburg. Their orders were simple: to secure the road and railway network ahead of the division's advance, and to check for remnants of German resistance. The war was almost over, but the area was still unstable. Isolated pockets of enemy soldiers, scattered artillery fire, and bridges wired for demolition were common obstacles. The men had spent weeks pushing through wreckage and surrendering garrisons. What they were about to find had nothing to do with tactics or strategy. The patrol came across the train by chance. The locomotive stood silent on the tracks. Its cars stretched into the distance. The soldiers noticed that the wagons were sealed, but strangely still. No smoke, no guards, no movement. At first they assumed it was an abandoned munitions train, or perhaps one carrying refugees. The 743 RD Sherman tanks rolled closer, their crews wary of ambushes that sometimes hid behind stalled transports. But as they approached, they saw the faint outlines of human figures behind the wooden slats of the boxcars. One of the tankers dismounted and climbed onto a car, prying at a rusted latch. The door slid open with effort, and a rush of fetid air spilled out. What they saw inside defied anything they had experienced in months of combat. Dozens of skeletal figures lay huddled together in the darkness. The smell of filth and decay was overpowering. Some of the prisoners stirred weakly. Others remained still, their eyes glazed over. For a moment, the soldiers were too stunned to react. They had expected prisoners of war, not civilians, and certainly not hundreds of dying men, women, and children. There were no medical teams, no officers trained for such a discovery, and no protocol for what they were facing. Yet the reaction was instinctive. The men began breaking open the other cars, shouting for water and blankets. Canteens were emptied, rations were divided, and field medics were summoned from nearby units. The tankers used their vehicles' radios to contact command, reporting that they had found a train full of civilians, apparently prisoners. It was a message unlike any they had sent before. Word spread quickly through the ranks. Soldiers from the 119th Infantry arrived to help, pulling survivors from the wagons and laying them on the grass beside the tracks. The prisoners were too weak to speak. Many had to be lifted out by hand. The Americans fetched water from nearby streams and passed it carefully from helmet cups to trembling lips. They gave away their own rations of canned meat, chocolate, and crackers, though medics warned that too much food too quickly could kill those who had starved for so long. The men moved quietly, their faces pale with disbelief. A few of the guards who had abandoned the train were captured later that day, hiding in nearby woods. Their presence confirmed what the soldiers already suspected. The people they had found were concentration camp prisoners evacuated from Bergen-Belsen. The realization hit with a new weight. These were not accidental captives of war, but survivors of a deliberate system of extermination. The soldiers, many in their early 20s, found themselves suddenly responsible for more than 2,000 human lives. As reinforcement arrived, the area was secured, and an emergency relief effort began. Local villagers were ordered to bring food, milk, and blankets. Army doctors and medics established makeshift treatment posts near the tracks. The strongest of the survivors helped carry the weakest. Photographers from the U.S. Army Signal Corps documented the scene, capturing images that would later become some of the most haunting records of liberation. For the soldiers, the discovery of the Farsleben train changed the meaning of their mission. They had trained to destroy enemy positions and capture bridges, but on that day, their task was to save. One officer later wrote that it was the first time he understood what liberation truly meant. The men of the 743rd and 119th did not see themselves as heroes. They simply acted, driven by a basic recognition that the war was not only about defeating an army, it was about rescuing the remnants of humanity buried under its ruins. Every account from that day carried the same impression, the shock of seeing life reclaimed from the edge of death. There were no orders from headquarters, no plans or preparations. Only a moment when soldiers accustomed to battle were confronted with suffering that no weapon could fight. Their actions at Farsleben did not alter the course of the war, but for the people in those boxcars, it was a difference between extinction and survival. In the hours following the discovery of the train near Farsleben, the soldiers of the 743rd Tank Battalion and the 119th Infantry Regiment turned from fighters into rescuers. What had begun as a reconnaissance mission transformed into one of the largest spontaneous humanitarian efforts of the war's final days. The first priority was to save lives before exhaustion, and disease claimed the remaining survivors. The men immediately radioed for medical support and supplies. Within hours, units from the U.S. Army's 30th Infantry Division and attached medical detachments arrived, bringing field medics, stretchers, and blankets. The scene was overwhelming. More than 2,000 people had to be treated, many of them unable to stand. Some were barely breathing, their pulse faint and irregular. The Americans cleared the area around the tracks, spreading blankets on the ground and laying the survivors in rows under the open sky. Soldiers gave away their rations, using army canteens and helmets to provide small sips of water. Those with medical training began checking each person for signs of life, prioritizing children and the most fragile. The men worked in silence, interrupted only by the cries of those who realized they were finally free. Recognizing that their supplies were insufficient, the U.S. officers sought help from nearby villages. Under direct orders, German civilians from Farsleben and surrounding farms were compelled to assist. They were told to bring milk, bread, and any clean bedding they could find. Many arrived reluctantly, some stunned by what they saw. For the first time, ordinary Germans were forced to face the human consequences of the regime that had ruled them for 12 years. They were made to wash the survivors, carry them into shelter, and witness the suffering they had once ignored. The Americans quickly repurposed the village schoolhouse into a temporary hospital. Desks were cleared out, windows opened, and straw mattresses laid across the floors. Army doctors established triage stations to treat the most critical cases: severe dehydration, malnutrition, infections, and exposure. Field kitchens were set up, and medical units from nearby divisions began delivering supplies. Food distribution followed strict instructions. The survivors were fed only small portions at a time, diluted soup, milk, and bread softened in water. Doctors knew that sudden overeating could cause fatal shock in those who had starved for weeks. Every calorie had to be measured, every portion carefully given. Among the survivors were dozens of children, many orphaned and too weak to speak. Soldiers took turns watching over them, wrapping them in army blankets, and keeping fires burning through the cold April nights. The medics worked without rest, and the troops who had liberated the train stayed nearby, unwilling to leave the people they had found. Some of them slept outside the schoolhouse, guarding the perimeter, though no enemy remained. For days, their mission was not to fight, but to care. Photographers from the U.S. Army Signal Corps arrived soon after and documented the scene. Their images captured the faces of liberation in its purest form: skeletal figures bathed in sunlight, children reaching out to touch the uniforms of their rescuers, women holding cups of water as if they were treasures. The photographs would later become some of the most powerful visual records of the Holocaust's final hours. They showed not just suffering, but the fragile beginning of recovery. Within a few days, additional medical teams and nurses arrived, including members of the 95th Evacuation Hospital. The stronger survivors began to help care for others, forming small groups that cooked and distributed food. The smell of disinfectant replaced the stench of the boxcars. Soldiers scoured the area to ensure no one had been left behind. In nearby woods, they found a handful of prisoners who had crawled away from the train seeking water. Every person they found alive was brought back to the improvised camp. The efforts of the American troops and medical staff saved the vast majority of those found on the train. Despite the dire conditions, only a small number died in the following days, a remarkable outcome given their state of starvation and illness. The survivors gradually regained strength. Some began to walk again, others to speak, and a few even smiled when the soldiers handed them bits of chocolate or cigarettes as tokens of solidarity. By the end of the week, the once silent train tracks had turned into a field hospital filled with the sounds of life returning. What had been a scene of despair became one of endurance and rebirth. For the soldiers who had taken part, the rescue at Farsleben became the most meaningful moment of their service. They had fought their way across Europe, but here, for the first time, they felt that their weapons had truly served their purpose, not to destroy, but to save. Historically, these actions were documented in U.S. Army archives, eyewitness reports, and photographs preserved by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They stand as one of the most complete accounts of a spontaneous liberation effort in the final days of World War II, carried out not by order, but by instinct and compassion. The rescue at Farsleben did not end with the opening of the train's doors. In many ways, that moment was only the beginning of a new kind of battle, one that required endurance, compassion, and a strength of spirit that few soldiers had ever been trained to possess. The men of the 30th Infantry Division, along with medical personnel from nearby units, remained on site for days. They rotated in shifts, keeping watch over survivors, monitoring the sick, and maintaining order amid the chaos. The war still raged only a few miles away. But for those soldiers, the front line had shifted from the battlefield to the human body itself. Every day brought new challenges. The survivors were suffering not only from starvation, but from diseases that spread easily in close quarters. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia threatened to undo the fragile progress of the rescue effort. The soldiers and medics had to disinfect the area, burn contaminated clothing, and isolate the worst cases to prevent further outbreaks. They wore masks and gloves when treating the sick, but supplies were limited, and most worked with little protection. Despite their precautions, a few soldiers fell ill, weakened by exhaustion and exposure. The risk of infection was constant, but none of them withdrew. The psychological strain was immense. These were men who had fought through Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Rhineland. They had seen cities destroyed, comrades killed, and enemies captured. Yet what they encountered at Farsleben tested them in a way that combat never had. The raw suffering of civilians, especially children, left them shaken. In letters and diaries written later, many described the experience as the moment when the full meaning of the war came into focus. They realized that beyond every destroyed bridge and captured town lay a human story that defied military logic. Some of the younger soldiers broke down. They had joined the army as boys, trained to kill or survive, but not to confront death in this form. Medics recalled moments when men stepped outside the makeshift hospital to compose themselves, standing silently under the cold spring rain. Others coped by focusing on routine, cleaning wounds, distributing food, carrying bodies to burial sites. The work was endless, and the line between hope and despair blurred with each passing hour. The villagers of Farsleben were required to assist in the cleanup and burial of those who had not survived. Under the supervision of U.S. officers, they dug graves on the outskirts of the town and helped disinfect the schoolhouse. For many, it was their first direct encounter with the crimes of the regime they had lived under. The Americans forced them to understand that the war was not just about lost battles or ruined cities. It was about what had been done to these people. In the first 24 hours after liberation, several of the weakest prisoners died despite all efforts. Their bodies were carried away with care, wrapped in blankets, and laid to rest nearby. Army chaplains performed brief burial rites in multiple languages, honoring the dead as best they could. The survivors, still too weak to stand, watched from the windows. Some wept quietly. Others stared into space, unable to process that they were free, but still surrounded by death. The medical staff continued their work day and night. They cataloged the patients, recorded conditions, and began transferring the most critical cases to field hospitals as transport became available. The process was slow and dangerous, but every life saved gave meaning to the ordeal. Doctors and nurses who arrived from the 95th Evacuation Hospital later described the operation as one of the most difficult of their service. They had treated soldiers before, but never such a massive group of civilians in such dire condition. As the days passed, the soldiers' exhaustion deepened. They slept in shifts on the floor of the schoolhouse or inside their vehicles. The smell of disinfectant and sickness filled the air. Yet morale held steady, sustained by a small moment of light, a child taking her first steps outside the boxcar, a survivor thanking them in broken English, a nurse singing softly as she worked. These moments reminded them that their suffering had purpose, that they were witnesses to the rebuilding of life from near extinction. In his diary, one Army medic wrote that the experience changed him forever. He wrote that war had taught him to save his fellow soldiers, but Farsleben had taught him to save humanity itself. That sentiment echoed through the ranks of everyone who served there. The battle for Farsleben was not fought with weapons, but with compassion and endurance. In a war that had shown the depths of human cruelty, the soldiers who stayed by that train proved that mercy could still exist, even in the ruins of a dying world. Historically, accounts from soldiers and medics who participated in the rescue confirmed that the operation lasted several days and that medical teams continued treating survivors for weeks afterward. Though some of the weakest prisoners died from starvation and disease, most were saved. For those who witnessed it, the experience at Farsleben marked one of the most haunting and transformative events of the European campaign. In the weeks that followed the discovery of the train near Farsleben, the initial shock of liberation gave way to an immense logistical and humanitarian effort. The survivors, many of whom were still too weak to walk or even sit upright, required long-term medical care and rehabilitation. American military authorities coordinated with the Allied Command and international relief agencies to arrange their transfer from the improvised hospital at Farsleben to established care facilities. What began as an emergency field operation soon evolved into a structured relief mission involving doctors, nurses, and civilian organizations from across Europe. By late April 1945, the survivors were moved in groups to temporary camps and hospitals throughout the region, including facilities in Hillersleben, Leipzig, and Hanover. The British Army, which liberated Bergen-Belsen itself on April 15th, sent additional medical personnel and supplies to assist the Americans in caring for those from the Farsleben train. Many of the survivors were later transferred to France and Switzerland, where refugee reception centers had been established for displaced persons. The process took weeks. Every move required careful coordination to prevent further illness or death. Children received special attention. Dozens of them were orphans, their parents lost in the chaos of deportations or dead from starvation. Relief workers from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee began the delicate work of tracing surviving relatives. In many cases, none could be found. Some of the youngest were later adopted by families in Europe and the United States. For these children, the war's end did not immediately bring peace, but the beginnings of new lives shaped by the compassion of strangers. Eyewitnesses later recalled that the survivors' first clear memory of freedom was often the same: the outstretched hand of an American soldier lifting them out of boxcar. To them, the soldiers were not symbols of victory or occupation, but of life itself. Survivors described the experience as a rebirth, a transition from the sealed darkness of the train into light, warmth, and air. Photographs taken by the U.S. Army Signal Corps became enduring testaments to this moment. They circulated in post-war reports and newspapers, though the full story of Farsleben remained relatively unknown to the wider public for decades. Among the liberated were brothers Naftali and Israel Meir-Lau, who had survived multiple camps before being placed on one of the Bergen-Belsen evacuation trains. Naftali, then 17 years old, later became an Israeli diplomat and journalist, and his younger brother Israel Meir-Lau eventually rose to become the chief rabbi of Israel. Naftali Lavi, later Lavi, would recount their experiences in his memoir, Balaam's Prophecy, describing the liberation at Farsleben as the moment that restored his faith in humanity after years of despair. Their testimony became one of the most well-documented survivor accounts, linking Bergen-Belsen's final evacuation to the events near Magdeburg. For the American soldiers, the impact of the discovery lingered long after the war ended. Many returned home deeply changed by what they had seen. Some corresponded for years with survivors they had helped. Others, haunted by the memory of the train, struggled to explain it to their families. In letters and oral histories recorded later, they often spoke of Farsleben as the day they truly understood why the war had been fought. One tanker from the 743rd Battalion wrote that every medal he received afterward felt insignificant compared to the memory of handing a starving child a piece of bread. The images from Farsleben also entered the historical record. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem, and numerous archives later identified the photographs and testimonies from that day as crucial evidence of Nazi evacuations in the war's final phase. Unlike the liberation of fixed camps, the Farsleben rescue showed the mobile dimension of the Holocaust, how death itself traveled by rail until the very last days of the conflict. As the survivors recovered and began new lives, their paths spread across continents. Some settled in Israel, others in Europe or North America. A few returned to Germany decades later to visit the site of their rescue. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the event, former prisoners and American veterans met again near Farsleben. They stood together on the same railway line, now overgrown with grass, to commemorate what had happened there. The reunion was marked not by speeches of triumph, but by quiet gratitude. The soldiers were old men by then, and the survivors had become grandparents, but the bond between them remained intact, a shared understanding born in the most unlikely of places. Historically, the liberation of the Farsleben train is one of the best documented rescues of Holocaust survivors by U.S. forces in the final days of World War II. Nearly all of the 2,500 people aboard the train survived the ordeal. Their survival was a direct result of the compassion and initiative of ordinary soldiers who refused to look away. In a war defined by destruction, the aftermath of Farsleben became a rare story of renewal, one where the instinct to save overcame the machinery of death that had dominated Europe for 6 years. In the years that followed the war, the liberation of the train at Farsleben slowly emerged from the obscurity of military reports and became recognized as one of the defining acts of humanity in the final days of World War II. The photographs taken by the U.S. Army Signal Corps became some of the most haunting and important visual records of the Holocaust's end. They depicted not the grandeur of victory, but the quiet dignity of rescue. Soldiers kneeling beside skeletal figures, carrying children, offering water, and restoring life where death had been expected. These images stood apart from traditional depictions of liberation because they captured the precise moment when the machinery of destruction had finally been interrupted by compassion. For decades, the story of Farsleben remained known mostly among those who had been there. The soldiers who participated rarely spoke of it publicly. Many returned home and resumed their civilian lives, their memories buried under the weight of ordinary post-war existence. The survivors, scattered across continents, carried the memory differently, through their families, their writings, and their faith. In Israel, Europe, and the United States, some of them told the story of how, on a railway line in a dying Germany, strangers in American uniforms became the first proof that the world had not entirely forgotten them. Historians began to revisit the event in the late 20th century, when survivors and veterans began reconnecting. Archival research confirmed the exact location near Farsleben and identified the units involved. The 743rd Tank Battalion and the 119th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division. The discovery was also linked to the broader pattern of evacuations from Bergen-Belsen in April 1945. As documentation emerged, the Farsleben rescue became a crucial case study for scholars examining the collapse of the Nazi system and the improvisational nature of its final atrocities. Unlike the liberation of concentration camps by organized military forces, Farsleben was a spontaneous act of discovery and moral clarity. Reunions between survivors and liberators began in the 1990s, often organized by families of those who had been rescued or by historians seeking to preserve first-hand testimony before it disappeared. At one such gathering in 1995, marking the 50th anniversary of the event, elderly soldiers and aging survivors met again on the same ground where the train had once stood. They shared photographs, letters, and memories. Some of the survivors brought their children and grandchildren, who for the first time met the men who had given them their lives back. One American veteran was quoted as saying that he had never thought himself as a hero, that on that day he and his comrades had not felt like liberators, but like witnesses to something far greater than themselves. The memorialization of the event took form gradually. In the town of Farsleben, a modest monument was erected near the railway line. The inscription, written in German, English, and Hebrew, reads, "Here, on April 13, 1945, life triumphed over death." It stands not far from the original site where the freight cars once rested, surrounded by open fields that have long since returned to quiet. The memorial does not glorify war. Instead, it invites reflection on the fragility and endurance of life. Each year, small remembrance ceremonies take place there, attended by local students, historians, and descendants of those who were rescued. In the United States, the story of Farsleben gained renewed attention through oral history projects and the preservation of veterans' accounts. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and Yad Vashem in Jerusalem both include documentation and photographs from the event. These archives ensure that the rescue is remembered not as an isolated incident, but as part of the broader moral landscape of the war, a moment when ordinary soldiers, without orders or preparation, made a decision that would save thousands. The legacy of Farsleben extended beyond commemoration. It became a lesson in moral responsibility for future generations. Military academies and Holocaust education programs have cited it as an example of how ethics and empathy can exist even within the machinery of war. For survivors, it remained a symbol of rebirth. Many described their lives afterward as borrowed time, a gift made possible by those who chose to act. Today, the story continues to resonate because it bridges the space between destruction and restoration. It demonstrates that even in the darkest hours of history, moments of profound humanity can emerge, not as grand gestures, but as simple acts of decency. The soldiers who stopped the train at Farsleben did not know they were stepping into history. They only knew that they could not look away. And because they chose to see, thousands of others lived to see the world rebuilt. The story of the train at Farsleben stood as a reminder that the end of a war is not measured by the silence of guns, but by the restoration of humanity. The liberation of those 2,000 men, women, and children did not change the outcome of the global conflict, nor did it alter the maps drawn in the aftermath. Yet, in its quietness, it revealed something essential about the nature of victory. True victory was not conquest, not destruction, not the raising of flags over ruined cities. It was a moment when human beings, hardened by battle, chose compassion over indifference. For the soldiers who found the train, the discovery shattered every certainty they had carried through years of war. They had seen death before, but not like this. On the battlefield, death had rules. It followed orders, obeyed tactics, and could be justified by survival. But here, on the tracks near Farsleben, they encountered death as something senseless, industrial, and absolute. The war they thought they understood suddenly revealed its deepest meaning. That its true enemy was not another army, but the very idea that human life could be treated as expendable. In lifting those people out of the wagons, they were not merely rescuing victims. They were reclaiming the moral ground that war had tried to erase. History often reduces events to numbers, casualties, divisions, tonnage, victories. Yet what happened at Farsleben defied arithmetic. Each life saved was not a statistic, but an entire universe restored. A child who would one day have a family, a mother who would live to tell her story, an old man who would die years later in peace rather than in silence. All of them were fragments of the human world rebuilt through one act of mercy. The soldiers did not know their names, and the survivors would never remember all their rescuers, but the connection between them endured across generations. It became proof that even amid collapse, the human instinct to protect life could survive. In the moral landscape of the 20th century, scarred by the scale of destruction, the Farsleben rescue offered a counterpoint, a moment of defiance against despair. It showed that decency was not the privilege of peace, but could exist within the most violent of contexts. The men who stopped that train had been trained to destroy. Yet in the final days of war, they discovered that their greatest strength lay not in power but in restraint. They had learned to cross rivers, seize bridges, and break through defenses. But at Farsleben they crossed an invisible boundary, from soldiers to witnesses, from combatants to caretakers of life. The survivors carried a memory as a form of moral inheritance. For them, the faces of their liberators embodied a truth that no ideology could erase, that humanity could still choose compassion, even when surrounded by its own ruins. Their lives, built anew in the aftermath, became the living continuation of that choice. Each child who grew up, each family rebuilt, each story told decades later was a quiet echo of that single day when strangers chose to save rather than to turn away. In the decades that followed, the story of Farsleben became less about the past and more about the question it posed to the future. It asked what it means to be human in times when the structures of civilization collapse. It challenged generations to remember that moral action does not require orders, only conscience. The soldiers who opened those train doors did not act because of command or reward. They acted because something within them refused to accept the sight of suffering as inevitable. In the long arc of history, the train near Farsleben remained a small event, a footnote to the end of a vast and terrible war. Yet its meaning reached far beyond its size. It was a moment when the line between destruction and redemption became visible. The world learned that the truest form of strength is not domination but empathy, not vengeance but mercy. The soldiers did not conquer a city or capture a fortress. They simply opened a door and let life step back into the world. In that act, they achieved something greater than victory. They restored the idea that even in humanity's darkest hour, goodness could still prevail.